the newsagents.
Is to stop messing around and get behind the leader. The fact of the matter is, most people in the country are not interested in all of this Westminster tittle-tattle. And quite frankly, the people who keep putting my name in there are not my friends.
That was Kemi Badenoch on Sunday on Sky News. She is the Conservative Business Secretary. And whilst those people are not her friends, she appears to be in a WhatsApp group with exactly those people. It has just been revealed by Pippa Crerar at The Guardian that there is a group called, wait for it, Evil Plotters on WhatsApp. And your guess is as good as ours as to whether they're talking about housing policy or environmental issues or maybe tea room.
Or maybe how to get rid of Rishi Sunak. So while she says get behind him and shut up, bit problematic that she's a member of this particular WhatsApp group. And they're obviously all committed to cutting taxes and dealing with immigration. The problem is that in Washington, not part of the evil plotters, the IMF has just come out and said, you can't cut taxes right now in the UK. The economy isn't strong enough. Welcome to the newsagents. It's John.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis.
And it must have sounded so great when Kemi Badenoch did the tours of the TV studios on Sunday and, you know, firmly, squarely, forcefully said, you've all got to get behind Rishi. And then you can imagine when Pippa Crerar from The Guardian found out, oh no, she's a member of a WhatsApp group called the Evil Plotters. It's just too good to be true, isn't it?
Maybe it is too good to be true. And maybe no one who was actually trying to overthrow the Prime Minister would literally have a WhatsApp group on their phone called Evil Plotters. But I don't know about you, when I look down my contacts list on the phone, it is full of people who do the job that their name is by. John Carpet is the carpet cleaner, and Lee, window cleaner.
Carpets?
Yeah, you do my carpet.
Lewis, window cleaner.
Do you not have that in your phone?
Sorry, wait, you have someone called John Carpet in your phone?
I don't think that's his real name, but he is called John and he cleans our carpets.
Are you
Now,
sure?
I've got Joseph the Builder.
Right, Joseph the Builder. So on that basis, which obviously is not, I mean, it's
bit upstairs, downstairs, isn't it,
straw
Emily?
poles. Well, I don't clean my own windows on a ladder. I mean, I'll be the first to tell you that.
That's just as well.
But I guess to get back to the point, would you call yourself an evil plotter if you were an evil plotter? Or has it got to be a joke?
I suppose there's a degree of self-parody involved in it. But just seeing it written down, it just stirs again that whole pot once more that the Tories are kind of causing trouble. And probably Rishi Sunak does sit in Downing Street and think, who can I trust? Answer, oh, blimey, very few.
But the reason this matters is because there is sort of day by day, week by week in Westminster, through different newspapers, through different things that are emerging, more and more details, more flesh being put on the bone of, and I hate to sound like Nadine Dorries here, not for the first time, but of a plot, of the plot, right, to remove Sunak. So what did the Times have a story of just the other day? But naming basically the person that Nadine Dorries has been hinting at, talking
Dr.
about
No.
all this time, Dr. No, Dougie Smith, who is the husband of Munira. It gets all a bit criminology here, but it's the husband of Munira Mirza, who used to work for Boris Johnson. Munira Mirza walked out of Downing Street during Partygate, resigned on Boris Johnson.
Actually, she left when Boris Johnson accused Keir Starmer
Yes.
of failing to hold Jimmy Savile to
Yes,
account
she
when
said
he
it
was
was a
DPP.
bridge too far.
I thought that was interesting because it crossed for her a moral line, and she walked out that point because she wanted the Prime Minister to withdraw his comments and he wouldn't.
Although, yes, and Nadine Dorries' point in her book, where she basically says that she describes this sort of series of plots against then Boris Johnson, she basically described this kind of sort of party within a party of the Conservative Party that she claims through various different Conservative leaders, whoever is the leader, is always sort of pulling the strings, sort of shadowy figures, of whom Dougie Smith, a kind of consummate party fixer, would be one. And she says that he, among others, lots of other people that you probably have never heard of, not household names even in their own households, are essentially pulling the strings and now turning their attention on Sunak, trying to get rid of him, and at the same time, you know, commissioning polling that's embarrassing for Sunak, that mysteriously ends up on the front page of the Daily Telegraph, among others. And then this is all part of a kind of concerted series of strikes against the Sunak premiership.
Can I just ask you both a question?
No, the answer is no.
Do you know Dougie Smith?
No.
No.
None of us do.
I don't recall doing, but I could. I bet
We've all been in the same room
as him.
Yeah.
It's so fascinating, isn't it? That the three of us kind of
don't
spent a
do
bit
this
of time
in years.
Westminster, do know quite a few people, and again, this is where Nadine, may well have a point that none of us seem to know him. I mean, I'm sure there are other, maybe more right-wing journalists who have kind of got to know him and have close terms with him, but I don't know.
Well, and they're all building, right, and Badenoch is undoubtedly one of the figures around whom there is a lot of attention, and that there is a suggestion that, if there were to be a vacancy, if the ball were to come loose from the back of the scrum, as Boris Johnson famously put it, that she would put her hat into the ring and she would be one of the favourites. I mean, that doesn't look imminent right now, but there are flashpoints. There's obviously the by-elections in the middle of February, there's the local elections as well, and all of this is cumulative. It is the death by 1,000 cuts kind of thing. And what Sunak and Number 10 are doubtless worried about is that however small this kind of apparatus is, there is clearly something afoot that is at least trying to put the mechanisms in place to move against him when and if the time comes.
I mean, I would say that I talked to a fairly senior figure last week who may or may not be part of this plot, and I was asking them about Simon Clarke's resignation, and I said, oh, well, that didn't seem to go anywhere, did it? That sort of fizzled out as soon as it came. And they said, watch this space. And what strikes me, and I think you're absolutely right on the timing, or at least I did think you were right on the timing, that it's kind of the May elections, the by-elections, that's 3 months away. I don't think we can carry on this pace for 3 months, right? I think something has got to happen more quickly than that. I mean, the by-elections are in February, but I don't understand how whatever happens to this plot sort of just carries on gently building momentum. Whilst Rishi Sunak just sits there going, it's fine.
I mean, we still haven't got an answer. And maybe this sounds a really kind of esoteric point to be discussing on the pod. But that poll that we have discussed on the podcast that was in the Daily Telegraph, we still don't know who was behind it, who funded such extensive field work, who were the people pulling the strings, to what ends? Because it does matter, because the polling companies themselves all signed up to a charter where you need to be able to say who you are doing this polling for, so that there is a degree of transparency over how much trust you can place in it, who actually owns the poll,
paid for it,
who pays for it, who owns it. And we still don't know the answer to that. And I find it
just to
fascinating.
recap, because we do know that it was commissioned on the same day as the Rwanda bill first went through Parliament in mid-December. And so whatever that poll was meant to do, for it to emerge just before the second reading was one coincidence too far for many people. It looked as if it had been set up to try and redirect how MPs were going to vote in the Commons that day.
I suppose the calculation for any plotters would be, to answer your point, Emily, on the timing would be that right now there are two things that are still basically on Sunak's side. One is that there is still a clear, I think, majority of Conservative MPs, bulk of Conservative MPs, who still conclude that it would be madness for the Conservative Party to launch another round of bloodletting and have yet another leader, another Prime Minister within the same parliaments. So that bulk is still there. So, maybe you could get to the 55 letters that you need to trigger a leadership contest, but they still plump for Sunak. What's the point of doing that unless you're actually going to get rid of him? And the other thing is that part of that calculation is that there is still enough Conservative MPs willing to give him the benefit of the doubt, because there's enough time that maybe give 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, so that Sunak can at least begin to try and turn it around. If by the time you get to, say, the May elections, that time is elapsed, and perhaps then you get enough Conservative MPs who think, well, look, yes, it would be madness for us to have another leader, but it would be just as mad, or just as mad in a different way, for us to go into a general election, know that we're going to get absolutely hammered, and maybe not just hammered, like maybe you accept we're going to lose office, but maybe reduced in numbers to such an extent that we are out of power for a generation. And maybe the Conservative Party thinks this is about damage limitation now. It isn't even necessarily about winning the election, it's about losing it as well as you might do.
Look, we've talked about the five families, except we try and ban ourselves from saying the five families. we've talked about the various different plotting groups within the Conservative Party and the kind of allegiances of each. We haven't ever considered that the International Monetary Fund, based on 19th Street, 3 blocks up from the White House, might be part of the conspiracy against Rishi Sunak.
Famous Marxist over the IMF. Of course.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But today it has come out and said, giving revised economic forecasts for the UK economy and revising the growth forecast downwards, that this is not a time for Jeremy Hunt to be cutting taxes in his budget, which is coming up in early March. At the same time as Jeremy Hunt has been giving very strong hints that tax cuts is exactly what he wants to do in that budget, brackets, with a general election beckoning.
It is such a central tenet to Rishi's kind of re-election campaign, this idea that you are giving people back their money. And I don't think you can overestimate how important he and the Chancellor both feel this is going into any general election. In fact, when we interviewed the Chancellor after the autumn statement, and we made the case that actually that the sort of so-called headroom, this horrible word, the fiscal headroom, in other words, like the box of money, if you like.
How much you got left.
How much you got left. What you could spend that on could be spent on propping up finances to our public services, instead of going towards the first set of tax cuts that were announced, the national insurance tax cuts that were announced by the Prime Minister last November. And I think he accused us of being, left-wing for saying that actually that money, was going to be taken out of public services. The IMF, as you said, this Washington-based cabal of Marxists, has said that the UK economy would need to generate higher tax revenues to meet the escalating demands for spending on public services without resorting to extra borrowing. So in other words, they're not just saying don't cut taxes, they're saying, mate, you should actually be putting them up because the cuts to our public services are going to be so extreme.
Yeah, I mean, the reason this matters is twofold, I think. One is that it relates to exactly what we were just talking about, which is that one of the reasons that Sunak and Hunt are pressing for tax cuts so much is precisely because they are afraid of and that they want to placate the right of the Conservative Party, at least some of whom are involved in this plot, and try and prove their spurs as Conservatives to show what real Conservatives they are by saying, look, we're cutting taxes again and again and again. But this, of course, is all part of the hangover of the Truss period and a reminder that the UK lost a great deal of economic credibility in the autumn of 2022. That was the reason in the end that Hunt had to come in and do a series of pretty grisly things, including putting taxes up and on a series of measures to try and get the crosshairs of the international capital markets off our back. This is at least to some extent a reminder that the crosshairs never truly left us. And when you lose that credibility internationally, it is harder to win it back. And it's just a reminder that the manoeuvrability that Hunt had to begin with going into this, partly because the headroom is not that substantial, as you say, Emily, was already pretty limited. This potentially just reminds him that he's got an even tighter tightrope to walk than
that has an effect in the Treasury of the thinking of the senior civil servants who will be warning, look, you don't want to go where Truss ended up. I mean, it won't be as dramatic, but you saw what happened in the bond markets, the cost of government debt, and then it would be game over. And of course, the dividing line that you're trying to create with that policy, as Emily, you were saying a moment ago, is to try and differentiate yourself from the Labour Party. Look, they're going to spend 28 billion on green taxes that's coming out of your wage packet to fund it, and we are putting more money back into your pockets. That's the difference between Labour and Conservative. It's the time-honoured dividing line in British politics.
Sort of reassuringly traditional, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it's reassuringly traditional. But if you've got the IMF saying, whoa, this could be very counterproductive, you end up possibly with Labour looking like the really sensible economic conservatives, small c, by, not promising tax cuts, and it actually helping Keir Starmer along the way.
Look, I guarantee that within sort of hours or maybe even minutes of us publishing this episode, we will have heard back from the government on this line, and we will be told that actually there are all sorts of polls and all sorts of bodies, and they often get their forecasts wrong. And don't forget the OECD, predicted X in March, but actually came down to Y 3 months later. And I think all this is true, that there is no one body that is sort of forecast proof that it gets things right 100% of the time. But I think it adds to this image, which you talked about, of where Britain sits, on the international stage, are you actually going to go against the IMF? The IMF is famously, this awful phrase, the body that we went to in the 1970s, cap in hand, to borrow money. The IMF is the person, the banker of last resort, in other words, who bails out Greece when Greece is doing badly, who bails out failing economies when they're doing badly. So you have to be pretty sure that you're on a safe wicket before you go, load of claptrap.
One of the problems that the government's got at the moment is that they can emphasise tax cuts as much as they might like. And of course, as you say, John, it is an important dividing line. I can see why they've ended up there. But at a time when most of the polls suggest that the public would prefer to prioritise the restoration of public services. And when you have, for example, the Treasury tweeted this out the other day. They said, we've cut national insurance contributions for employees from 12% to 10%, a £450 a year saving for the average worker making £35,000 a year. £450 is a significant amount of money. You wouldn't seek to undermine it for a moment. But that is 37 quid a month. Again, no one's going to say no to it, but it's 37 quid a month. The danger for the Conservatives, and even some Conservative MPs are starting to talk about this, the danger is that by emphasising what are in the end relatively modest amounts, by comparison to the enormous cost of living increases that there have been, over the past 2 years, and actually taxes that are going up in other areas. There is more and more rumbling from Conservative MPs, for example, about council tax, and the fact that Michael Gove is basically having to bail out a whole array of councils because they're basically on the verge of going bust, and allowing them to increase council tax potentially by up to 5%, in some cases even more. And there isn't much point, Conservative MP for Mansfield was saying to this today, by robbing Peter to pay Paul, if that you're basically getting a modest cut from central government, only to find your local taxation going up by more, particularly when we consider that council tax is a regressive tax and hits the poor more than it does the rich.
But I suppose that if you are Conservative campaign headquarters and you're looking at polling numbers and you can sell tax cuts, that you hope that sleight of hand is not noticed by the public, and that Tories will say, we are the party that will give you your money and let you spend it the way you think best, whereas Labour will spend your money how they think best. And that's the dividing line that has been in for generations in British politics.
There is a bit of better news for Rishi Sunak.
Oh?
We're going to talk about it just after this. You like that? Smooth, right?
Smooth.
Sopel smooth.
So smooth.
So smooth. Smooth FM.
Like a
John
smoothie.
Sopel.
A little bit later, we are going to be talking about Laurence Fox. Claims and counterclaims of racism, and of a Twitter spat, and of the people who took him to court, and of how he then tried to take them to court for defamation. It's a complicated and a really weird tale, and we've got one of the central characters here in the studio to talk us through what she did.
But before we get to that, we're going to Northern Ireland and to go to Stormont, where we all woke up to the news that maybe power sharing is back on the agenda 2 years after power sharing stopped. And it is the kind of fiendish complexity of Northern Ireland politics made even more difficult by Brexit and the trading arrangements that would have to come in as a result of the island of Ireland having part of the island which is inside the European Union, and the 6 counties in the north not in the EU, and how you deal with trade. So I'm looking at Lewis Goodall now, because I'm thinking,
you sit next to me.
If anyone can take us through the complexity of where we've got to and what has shifted that makes this possible, you're the man.
It is complicated, but this is the biggest kind of hangover of Brexit. There are all sorts of hangovers of Brexit, but this is perhaps the most potent. John, it's like you say. Basically, to put it at its simplest, the UK tried to leave the EU. There's a reason why back in 1973, the UK and the Republic of Ireland joined the EU on exactly the same day, on the 1st of January 1973. It was to ensure that the trading arrangements between the two islands and between North and South remained seamless, as they had basically been even since independence of the Republic. Obviously, when the UK was going to leave the EU, that was no longer going to be the case. And there were great fears that basically, if the UK leaves the EU, you've got two choices. You either have a trade border between Northern Ireland and the Republic on the island of Ireland itself, or you have one between Great Britain, i.e. Scotland, Wales and England, the island of Great Britain, and Ireland. Both of them had drawbacks. Problem with the first one is that was considered completely off the table because of the Good Friday Agreement, it being built into the Good Friday Agreement in the peace process that you cannot have a land border. Problem with doing it the other way, having a border down the Irish Sea, is that this was completely unpalatable to the Unionists in Northern Ireland, because the thing that they dislike most is the idea of there being any kind of barrier between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, because they consider themselves as much part of the United Kingdom as anywhere else, and it has to be indivisible. So the answer to this in the end was basically a complicated arrangement that Boris Johnson came up with, where that Northern Ireland would leave the EU with the rest of the United Kingdom, but it would stay in the EU single market for certain goods. There would be a border down the Irish Sea, and there would be some checks. Now, the Unionists absolutely lost it over this for the reasons that I've just described, and as a result of this, in protest, pulled out of the power sharing arrangements in Northern Ireland. And if the thing about the power sharing arrangements is that if all of the big parties of both communities aren't taking part, then it cannot function. And that is why Stormont has basically been not in operation for 2 years, and Northern Ireland has basically been governed by civil servants, not by politicians.
Yeah, I mean, the answer to this, memorably, was Theresa May's rather clever solution, which was a backstop, which was one of those bits of legislation where if you didn't look too closely, it all worked quite well. Boris Johnson came in, ripped it up, promised there wouldn't be a border down the Irish Sea, and then promptly put, you've guessed it, a border down the Irish Sea. And so it created this very odd situation where the people who arguably had everything, i.e. the people of Northern Ireland, the DUP in particular, who had both trading bodies, were actually arguing that somehow they came out of this worse because they didn't feel as much part of the mothership of the United Kingdom. They walked out in protest at those checks on goods crossing from Britain to Northern Ireland, and that was the end of power sharing. And I think it's worth just putting in brackets that what has made this more complicated now is the elections of May in 22, which brought Sinn Féin to power as the largest party. And since we have seen power sharing, it has always been sort of accepted that the DUP
would be in the dominant position.
Was the dominant position, and Sinn Féin sort of snuck in as the deputy. If you remember those initial pictures of the Good Friday Agreement, was Ian Paisley for the DUP and Martin McGuinness from Sinn Féin. Now, Sinn Féin is in the dominant position, and the DUP are struggling to accommodate what this actually looks like in a leadership position. And so I think it is, actually, I'm going to say, no small credit to Rishi Sunak that whilst, you know, the plotters may be plotting and the WhatsAppers may be WhatsApping and the pollsters may be polling, he's actually saying, right, where's my legacy on this? I'm going to get the Windsor framework up and running to sort out trade with Northern Ireland properly, and I'm going to sort out power sharing at Stormont. And if he can sort of say in 2 years that is something that he has managed to succeed on, then I think that is definitely a stamp in his book.
It's definitely, it will be a feather in his cap. And I think that, you know, when the Windsor framework came out, kind of we talked about it on the podcast. That
with
it was
Bertie Ahern, I seem to remember.
Yeah, it was a significant achievement and a real feather in his cap.
In fact, it was exactly this time a year ago because I was in Morocco.
Obviously, you remember these things because you're always on holiday.
The Marrakesh Agreement.
Yeah,
the Marrakesh Agreement.
Exactly. So it will be a feather in his cap. And it will, and people say this is something that gives you a lasting legacy. Problem is, of course, that the Tories do not stand for elections in Northern Ireland, nor do any of the other political parties. And I wonder how much notice, how many votes there are in sorting out Northern Ireland in England, Scotland, and Wales.
Well, and we should say the reason why this appears to finally have been unlocked is that the DUP, main unionist party, you know, they were in this sort of very fraught overnight kind of conference of their executive where their leader, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, was trying to persuade them that the concessions that the DUP had won from the government, partly through the Windsor framework, but also by concessions that they managed to secure more recently over the last sort of few weeks and months, are worth it. So he has said, he's claimed that this deal will result in 0 checks, 0 customs paperwork on goods moving within the United Kingdom. Rishi Sunak's official spokesman today has said, I think on all these questions it would not be helpful at this stage to get into the detail. So that we're in a slightly odd position. We're in a slightly odd position.
Don't give
where
additional commentary.
Yeah, Donaldson has won the backing from his party to go back into power sharing, and that means, as Emily said, there will be a Sinn Féin First Minister, Michelle O'Neill, that's never happened before, and a DUP Deputy First Minister. That distinction in practice doesn't really mean anything because they are co-equal as part of the Good Friday Agreement, but obviously symbolically it's important. But we don't yet know exactly what the nature of this deal that they've secured from Downing Street is. And, when we see that detail, we'll basically get a better idea of whether it is that Jeffrey Donaldson has basically just blinked, has just realised that the party needs to go back into power sharing because otherwise, public services in Northern Ireland are falling apart, it's not being governed properly, the DUP could be punished from that, or whether Downing Street has given new concessions. And the danger with that, of course, is that and it all comes back again to Brexit and all of those dynamics that we saw back then, is that the right of the Conservative Party will be worried. They will say that what we do not want to see is that the UK government has in any way boxed itself into EU rules or any element of EU alignment in order to reduce the number of checks going down the Irish Sea, because that is still a shibboleth for them that we want to get our own trade deals and all of these sorts of things. So it takes you back exactly to that Rubik's Cube of Brexit that there was in those years, where it didn't matter which side you try to move the cube, there would always be a couple of squares still out of place. So basically we've got to wait for the detail.
The point about a Rubik's Cube, Paul Lewis, I think you're giving away a little bit of your own travails with the Rubik's Cube, is that it does actually end beautifully and symmetrically.
Yes, no, you're right. I may have to accept the fact this may not be a completely perfect metaphor, but
go back to Shibboleth. I love that one.
Yeah, exactly. But so we've basically this has got a long way to run before they actually take up those seats in Stormont again.
I also loved the drama of it all. I mean, the drama of it being signed
middle of the night.
Yeah. And apparently there were senior DUP leaders leaking information while these talks were going on, to the point that some people were wondering whether the room where these negotiations were taking place was bugged, because so much was seeping out of this room in the middle of the night. It's fabulous.
We should say there is another element of the sort of Brexit Rubik's Cube to come in, which still hasn't come in, which is that we are over the next few months going to see the checks introduced on fresh produce and goods coming in from the EU, which up to now, and that's into the UK, into Dover and so on, which up to now the UK government have basically chosen not to introduce because basically the paperwork of it was going to be so
make
onerous.
it a bit easier.
Yeah, it was going to be so onerous. The actual paperwork and bureaucracy of Brexit, actually making Brexit happen, will be so onerous. That is finally going to be introduced, and that is going to increase potentially food prices on certain goods, because every sort of minute and every 10 minutes, every half an hour that you have goods just waiting at the border adds costs. So Brexit is still unwinding.
And queues at Dover. Guess who's really, really angry about this? Guess who is really, really angry about the extra queues at Dover and the cost?
Is it Dover Council?
No.
Is it Kent Council?
No.
Is it the MP for Dover?
No.
Is it an MP who has made his name over being...
Jacob Rees-Mogg is furious. Bill Cash furious. All you need to do is to find the people who are really, really upset about the difficulties that these Brexit laws are creating for us are the Brexiteers.
Yes, well, Jacob Rees-Mogg famously said, of course, that food would be cheaper as a result of Brexit, which obviously has not happened just yet.
Lewis, you were very unkind to draw attention to the fact that I may have gone skiing for a couple of days in Geneva. We landed there were 3 guys who went.
Oh, I love this. This is the Geneva Airport security update.
Well, God.
Here, let's get the world's smallest violin out for John Sopel, shall we?
So there were 3 of us, one of whom...
John Sopel, I think I said.
One of whom was a big Brexit supporter, who was arguing as we got off the plane that Brexit has been an unalloyed joy and has been a great thing for everyone concerned. And we're going towards the passports, and he suddenly produces that he's got an Irish passport, left us, went straight through the line while the 2 people who said Brexit was a bad idea queued.
That's unfair, John.
That's very funny.
You might be suggesting some of these people are hypocrites, which
I wouldn't dream of it. Wouldn't dream of it.
One wouldn't do.
Slopel.
John Slopel.
That's your skiing
name. That is your skiing name.
Yeah.
Your skiing nom de plume.
Yep.
But it goes back to, again, that IMF thing. What is one of the problems for Sunak, from what the IMF has said, is that growth this year is going to be 0.6%, the second lowest in the G7. And again, more Brexit bureaucracy, anything that you're adding shock into the economic supply system, it just makes it harder and harder to get growth going again. By the way, you know how fast Russia is going to grow this year? Little quiz.
Is it going to be above the UK?
2.4%.
Wow.
Good to see those massive sanctions really, really hitting home in Moscow.
We're going to be speaking to Nicola Thorpe, the broadcaster who won her libel case against Laurence Fox, in a moment.
There has been a libel case that was heard at the High Court which has resolved itself. And it involved the very high-profile character Laurence Fox, once of GB News, who was fired. They parted company with him over his comments about a woman journalist. He is a provocateur, I think it's...
He's an attention seeker. I'm not sure how high profile he is, but in his own mind, he's massively high profile, and he definitely knows how to create a lot of noise.
But in the anti-woke ecosystem, he is a big noise. He is part of that kind of, everything is so woke, we've got to fight it. And so he gets accused of being a racist by 3 people. And he decides that he is going to take them to court. Actually, in return, he calls the others who've called him a racist a paedophile.
We just need the playground.
It's just the playground.
I mean...
Exactly. You call me a racist, I'm going to call you a paedophile, which is what he did. So there was this complicated case that went on where Laurence Fox was suing 3 of the people for calling him a racist, and he was being countersued for calling them a paedophile. And yesterday the resolution of the case came out, and the court found that Laurence Fox was probably a racist because of other comments that he had made, and therefore there was justification for the charge of calling him a racist.
What the judge did was fall slightly short of making a ruling on whether he could be described as a racist. She said it was substantially true after finding all these, tweets on his record. But what she did say is that it wasn't going to defame him. It was unlikely to cause serious harm to his reputation. And Laurence Fox had basically, in bringing about this defamation case, had said, I lost jobs and I had to pay more on my car insurance and I never worked in this area again. So he tried to make it a case about loss of his good character. The judge basically decided that didn't wash. So we're going to speak to the woman who was one of those 3 who was called a paedophile, who called Laurence Fox a racist, who was then sued by Laurence Fox in this defamation trial. Her name's Nicola Thorpe. She's a broadcaster. Well, joining us now is Nicola Thorpe. Just take us back to the beginning and what you first said about Laurence Fox, Nicola.
Sure. So it was in October 2020 and he'd tweeted about Sainsbury's, saying that he was going to boycott them because they were racist and had segregationist policies, because they'd created a safe space for black employees in light of Black Lives Matter and for Black History Month. I called him a racist for his tweet. 2 other people did as well. Colin, also known as Crystal, the drag queen, and Simon. And Laurence Fox responded by calling all 3 of us paedophiles. Now...
Sorry, I'm not laughing. It's just,
that descended pretty quickly, didn't it?
Yeah, it's just kind of playground.
Yes.
It's kind of...
Absolutely. My head was reeling. And this was during COVID. I was living alone at the time, and I just went... I don't know, what? And I've heard of other people saying, if somebody calls you a racist, then you respond with an equally, meaningless insult like paedophile. Now, of course, the key difference being the 3 of us, it was our honest opinion that Laurence Fox was and is a racist.
Can I just stop you at that point? Why would his calling out Sainsbury's for not giving a safe space make him a racist? What was it about that made you call him a racist?
Well, for me, it was very, very clear that he was sharing a tweet by Sainsbury's saying, we're celebrating Black History Month and creating safe spaces for our colleagues. Laurence, and anybody who disagrees with that is free to shop at a different retailer. If anyone who doesn't want to shop with an inclusive retailer, go elsewhere. To which Laurence Fox quote tweets going, I'm boycotting and I call on others to do so. That, for me, on the face of it, was very simple. He's outed himself proudly as a racist.
But does it really mean he's a racist, or does it just mean he didn't want to see shops getting involved in political campaigns?
If that was the point that he wanted to get across, he didn't go about it in a very good way. Also, and as was my case in court, it wasn't that tweet alone that brought me to the conclusion that he was a racist. It was his previous conduct as well, because the way in which my case differed to the other boys, as Colin and Simon, is I had to use the defence of truth whereas they were entitled to the defence of honest opinion.
Justification. Yeah.
Yeah, but it didn't even get to that, as we now know, because he didn't meet the bar for defamation.
So go on, what happens next? So
what happens next? We'd never met before, so we kind of had a Zoom call, the three of us, and said, you know, what do we want to do about this? We'd all had horrendous abuse after the paedophile claim, but particularly for Colin and Simon, it was horrific because they were two gay men, and two gay men in publicly as well. One was a drag artist, one had worked previously for Stonewall and had campaigned to equalise the age of consent for gay men. An accusation like that sticks differently and hits differently. But the three of us...
So you could brush it off. You know you're not a paedophile. He felt he was undergoing sort of more public censure because he was gay or because he was
Yeah,
a drag.
I mean, I definitely didn't brush it off because some of those tweets, and still to this day I do get them, were horrendous. And some people were tweeting my agent at the time saying, you know, you need to get rid of her and check her laptop and that kind of thing. So the three of us decided to sue him. And then he decided to counter-sue us for calling him a racist. And to pick up on the point that Laurence Fox is saying to people, oh, she actually lost her case. Now, last year, it is true that at an appeal, he appealed and I lost my claim against him because a judge ruled that the way in which he called me a paedophile was akin to mimicry, and people would have read it as such. Whilst I respect that decision, I don't agree with it.
So obviously, when you bring a libel action, it is a civil case. It's not a criminal case.
Sure.
What was the court case like? What was it like being in court against Laurence Fox? What was his demeanour? What was the behaviour like?
Wild. I mean, also to add, I was 37 weeks pregnant at the time, so I had lots of other things going on in my head. It was intimidating. It's one thing to read these words on Twitter. It's another thing to have them read out in court by his barrister in the wig and the gown and everything, and it suddenly took on this completely different, I don't know, it just felt even more intimidating. And the fact that at that point, I knew I had to prove that he was a racist, like it was a fact, like it was true. So there was an awful lot of pressure on there. His demeanour in court, he genuinely seems to believe what he says. And I think that so often he's quite easy to make fun of on Twitter. And other people say, actually, he's someone you should take seriously, whilst I don't think you should take his, politics necessarily seriously. He's backed by very influential, very wealthy people. So it's certainly not somebody who we should just be going, oh, he'll just disappear if you ignore him. He's not that boy in the playground. He is the boy who, if you ignore him, he will continue to pull the pigtails of everyone else in the room.
So wait, you're in the court. Are you now fighting being called a paedophile, or are you fighting calling him a racist? What is this?
My co-claimants are fighting being called paedophiles, and all three of us are fighting the racism counterclaim.
You are basically asserting and sticking by your assertion that he is racist.
Yes.
And did that find in your favour yesterday?
It didn't need to, because in order to have a successful defamation case, the claimant, or counter-claimant in this case, Laurence Fox, had to prove that what we said about him was defamatory and caused serious harm. Now, he didn't manage to meet the bar on serious harm, because what the judge said, and she said, I'm sure that Mr. Fox wanted to walk out of court saying, I'm not a racist, and that I wanted to walk out of court saying, he is a racist. But that's for another court on a different day, because actually what she judged on was the fact that the loss of his career, the loss of his political ambitions, etc., everything that he laid out in court. He even said that I was responsible for the increase in his car insurance and the reason why he can't get a mortgage. So this is what I'm fighting here in court. The stakes are extremely high, higher than a Twitter spat, as people have.
So what was the bar that he didn't reach then, or that it didn't reach in terms of defamation?
That
it couldn't be seen to have done him harm.
Because it was questionable about his reputation in the first place.
And could you still call him a racist now? Would you go back on Twitter and call him a racist?
I wouldn't go back on Twitter and do it because of my experience
But
you know, having done
he
it.
has been
But
on Twitter.
yes.
Let me read.
Wait, so let me just
I still
get
believe him to be racist, yes. And based on everything that I saw in court, I'm 100% on that.
He has put out on Twitter, anyone who hires Nicola Thorpe does so in the knowledge that she is unequivocally, unashamedly and publicly a racist. And then the final sentence, sue me.
With a kiss emoji, I believe.
With a kiss emoji. Yeah.
So what does that mean? Why are you a racist now?
He's just throwing the same accusation that I put towards him. But the key difference being there is no evidence, you know, that he's claiming I'm a racist, whereas he, as far as I'm concerned, showed
So
everything in court.
are you in the position now where this is over, a line has been drawn under it? Or does this, I mean, you know, reading Twitter now, it looks like it continues.
I mean, he's trying his best to make it continue. He's done this in previous cases with other people that he's had disagreements with online, and I gave him the oxygen 3 years ago, and I haven't given him it since. But look, this is a man, and it's not often been covered in the press. The reasons why I thought he was racist and the reasons why I still believe it, you know, he told a black man to off back to Jamaica. Excuse my language.
That's fine.
He shared a blacked up image of himself and his 2 children. He posted a swastika made out of the Progress Pride flag with the Black Pride flag on it. That's just 3. There are so many different instances. And for us, the 3 of us, it was so important that we had the right to exercise our free speech. And that's our opinion that someone's racist.
Are you glad you've done what you did?
Yes.
Do you feel a sense of relief that this has
I do, but I think yesterday I became quite worried. No matter what the result was going to be, and he even said it himself, any result is a loss and any result is a win to him. Whatever happens, he will use it to decide the direction of his next political campaign or whatever.
It's sort of the Trump playbook, isn't it?
Yes.
It's using a court appearance or using the oxygen of court to go further on your argument.
Yeah, I mean, he turned up at outside court yesterday. Now, the judgment was handed down electronically. We all got an email. But there he was saying, I'm going to make a statement outside court. He had no reason to go to court to make that statement other than to, you know.
And you said he came to court and performed the haka, the New Zealand Maori.
He did it twice.
War dance, right?
Yes.
Why?
This was during a cross-examination regarding taking the knee. And he was talking about meaningless kind of gestures in sport and how taking the knee shouldn't, you know, somebody shouldn't take the knee. Instead, they should be aggressive. And then he just went on and performed the haka. I mean, he was asked at one point, do you think it's ever okay for somebody to say, I hate black people? And he said, well, it depends. And he was asked to elaborate, to which he said, well, you know, it's okay to say I hate black people if I've just been ganged by a bunch of Ugandans. And the intake of breath from everybody in court was just like, I mean, this guy is digging himself a hole.
What was the response when he did the haka? I mean, I'm just trying to imagine, what were people doing?
I mean, I'm on trial there as well, right? You know, this is before I went to give my evidence, and the judges sat right in front of me, and I'm trying my best not to laugh. I'm just trying to keep a straight face as much as possible, which is very difficult at times. But
Does he know the haka?
I mean, was he doing the haka properly, or was it a parody of the haka?
It was a parody of the haka, which I daren't repeat because it just, it was just an uneducated interpretation of a tribal dance. Let's put it that way.
But, I mean, what comes out at the end of this, although you've won your court case, there's going to be no ceasing and desisting on the part of Laurence Fox, is there?
Not to me.
Yeah.
Perhaps to Simon and Colin, because, of course, they haven't had a hearing yet on their damages.
Right.
Because he owes them damages for having called them paedophiles and for the horrendous abuse that they got. He's been found responsible for that.
Is there a kind of lesson? You say you're glad you've done it, but he hasn't been chastened particularly. What would be your advice to other people?
I think he hasn't been chastened, but I would argue that perhaps more of his followers have seen him for what he really is during this process and are actually saying, do you know what, you potentially need to get help. He doesn't see it that way at all, but I think that it has shone a light on the justice system. And the fact that, yes, we have a right to freedom of speech in this country, but he was not exercising his right to freedom of speech. He was exercising his right to, as he said, falsely, and he admitted it was false, falsely accuse 2 gay men and myself of being paedophiles, and the law won't stand for that. That meant so much to my gay and queer friends who went, do you know what? There are people out there who are standing up for us on the internet. Equally, my friends of colour who've gone, finally somebody has stood up to him, the 3 of us, and said, you're racist and we're not going to back down if you threaten us with legal action.
Nicola. Sort of an amazing story, isn't it? Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you
for
very
having
much.
me.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Oh, I'm very much looking forward to seeing you tomorrow.
Good. Excellent.
It's going to be lovely.
Excellent. Good.
I'll bring in a cake or something.
Possibly.
Because what time will you get here tomorrow? Just remind us.
I'm not sure of the times exactly.
No, go on. Just tell us.
Sure exactly.
No, what time will you walk in the door next?
I don't know
No,
precisely.
when will you walk in the door next?
Emily, you've asked me that question. I still don't know which
I've
time.
got 14
There's no
hot
point
dogs.
pressing me.
Right.
My
John
lawyer
Sopel
will
won't be here
issuing-
tomorrow.
my
Will he be
lawyer
here on
will-
Thursday? No.
My lawyer will
he
be
be on
issuing a
Friday?
statement.
No. Will he be... Oh, my God. You're going to Australia again?
I'm going for a family visit. No, it's not a holiday.
It's not a holiday. It's definitely not a holiday. Whatever you do, don't call it a holiday.
Okay. See
Bye
you
for
soon.
now.
Bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.